for emerging professionals. Next up for our TPE presentation, we have Brenda Ice. Brenda is the Assistant Director and Dean of Campus Life at Scripps College. So I'm going to turn it over to Brenda to take us on.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As I was just introduced, I am Brenda Ice, and I am the Assistant Dean and Director of Campus Life at Scripps College in Southern California. In my role at Scripps, I serve as the overseer of the Office of Residential Life, the Office of Student Engagement, and our new student programs and orientation. The relevance of my conversation today is more directly connected to my work with the Placement Exchange, where this year in 2020, I currently serve as the chair-elect of our TPE Planning Committee. And that means that next year for 2021, I will serve as chair of our planning committee, where we will be in Kansas City. And so my work with TPE and kind of figuring out how to cultivate the recruitment process, not only for candidates and employers, has been one of my professional passion areas since I've gotten into the world of student affairs. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to spend some time with you all today and talk about things I've learned over the years, particularly around recruitment efforts, and more importantly, helping you think about your next step, whether you're in an active search or contemplating a move. You always want to think about the questions that will be posed of you and how you respond. But more importantly, today's conversation is really for you to think about the questions that you want to ask of the employers, of your colleagues, of the students, and everyone else that you might engage with, particularly in this virtual environment that we're in, where you may not be able to physically visit the campus, that you want to make sure that you get the appropriate sense of what it means to join this particular campus culture and community. I'd meant for this to kind of be interactive, and so hopefully as questions come in, that one of our moderators here can just pop up and kind of share those questions with me, and I'm happy to answer. But I thought I would begin by maybe framing from an employer perspective what it means to go through this recruitment process, and maybe how we frame the questions when we're seeking out folks to join our teams, and then use that as the framework of how you can then turn those questions into questions that you might be able to pose back to the people that you're interviewing with. I can tell you that in the 20 plus years that I've been in student affairs and higher education, each of my roles has had me serve as a primary recruiter or member of a recruitment team, and thinking about the types of questions we need to ask, whether that be from a student, staff, and paraprofessional position, all the way up to serving on search committees where we were seeking out the provost or even the president of the college. In each of those kind of processes, where I believe fundamentally employers or those seeking those to fill positions land in three particular areas. And so employers tend to focus on, and their questions tend to address areas of who are you, and what will you bring to our environment? And then the last one is, how will you work well with others? And so while those are three short questions, if you were to think about the span of all the questions that you're asked, either at a first round interview, second round interview, or even on campus experience, that fundamentally what employers or campuses are looking at or getting at to those three core questions. Who are you? What will you bring to the team? And how will you work with the team and the others on that program? And so if you think about that as foundationally what we're looking for as employers, then you can turn that on its ear a bit and then think about how you would then pose questions to basically get at the same thing. And so from a candidate standpoint, when you're thinking about entering into a first round, second round, or on campus or even virtual interview, maybe you're framing your questions in three platforms as well, by asking questions that ask, who are they? What have they done? And more importantly, how will they contribute to your growth? And I don't think it's as simple as asking those very specific questions, but if you frame it from that, then I think you can layer in those three particular categories very specifically to get at some of those framings. And so for a moment, I'd like to just to stop and say, if there are any questions currently, I can pause, but otherwise I was then going to jump into a moment where I actually provided you examples of those three distinct categories. Okay. Hearing or seeing none, then what I shall do is move on. And what we found, at least for me, is that these aren't the end-all be-all questions, but certainly starting points for you to consider. So if we think about the category of who are they, and this is the they is the collective institution, the department, the program of which you're seeking to join, you can ask questions of them like, what are you known for? What are your traditions on campus? And what are people talking about? If this were an environment where you could visit the campus, if you were to pose questions of people just walking around the campus, what are they going to say? What are they talking about? What pops up in your student paper? How, and those sorts of framings for you to get a better sense of who they are. Some of that you'll probably gather in your own research by visiting their website or reaching out to colleagues that you know that already work at that institution. But these can be ways in which you pull out from those particular institutions a little bit more about how other people perceive or have a level of self-awareness about what's happening on your campus. The next category is the what have they done? And this is a way for you to frame and understand the possibilities of joining the particular program or department. And the what have they done can run the gamut, again, based off of what you found on their website or in their reading materials that you might use as a follow-up question. So certainly framing it from that perspective. But if you can't really find the information from their website or in your own research, then here are questions that fundamentally you might want to consider. What three things would students use to describe your department? When was the last time you were in the school paper, and what was that about? What initiatives did you recently start? Are any of them tied to strategic planning? And if so, if your campus does have a strategic plan, where does this department fit in kind of executing or implementing any of those strategic initiatives? And then lastly, in light of where we are in our own campus response to COVID-19, it would be appropriate for you to maybe follow up on what you've seen on their website or literature around their campus response to COVID-19 and where these particular people that you're interviewing with played a part in that. Were they part of the development of the process of which the students departed or went into a remote learning and then even get to a place where they were part of like the deployment and implementation. It may then help frame you in better understanding where you would fit in and if this is actually a fit for you in joining this particular community. The last section is how would they contribute to your growth? And this is where I think sometimes as new professionals or even sometimes mid-level professionals equate this to be what are professional development funds like? And this is actually thinking broadly and thinking beyond just professional development funding, but how in being in this space will they contribute to your overall learning and potential while in the position, but more importantly, thinking beyond this position and next steps. What will you utilize or what can they contribute to your overall success while you're in the position, but then the tools that you could use to move on beyond this position, whether it be at that institution or even leaving that campus. And so there you might want to frame questions around what will success look like for you in this particular role? Are there opportunities for change to take place? Is this an opportunity for you to maybe pose questions around while the campus will probably do a really good job of talking about their strengths and assets that they have, this may be an opportunity for you to explore and ask questions around where have been some maybe pitfalls or opportunities that this particular position or maybe the contributions that you bring could actually maybe become that change agent and think differently about the way in which they operate. And those can become the framing and questions that you want to consider. I think the next stage is a layered approach, is that while you're considering all of these particular questions, it's important to remember your audience. And then that means if you are doing in your first round of experiences, thinking about the phone interview process, who's on the other end of that, or in our virtual environment, who's going to be on the other end of that camera that's going to be part of your experience. Knowing who those folks are and their individual roles means then you're being intentional about the type of question that you ask of them. So even if you're using those 3 guiding principles, then making sure that it actually attends to the people or the audience of which you're chatting with. So in most in positions, particularly in the area of student affairs, it's likely that you're going to engage with students to some degree. And so you can still ask these 3 fundamental pillars, but making sure that you frame it from a student perspective. And so this is where you could get at thinking about their own experiences and how they perceive their time either working with that department or student affairs as a whole. We're also thinking about ways in which they've had conflict or concern about that particular unit, and getting insight from a student perspective can be quite insightful sometimes as you're thinking about the overall picture and thinking about joining that particular community. It's likely that you will have a level of engagement with peers and or colleagues in that. And so thinking about framing your questions, maybe getting at the campus culture or the departmental culture, the team dynamic, how folks get along, what happens when conflict arises, and how do they kind of work through those pieces. You'll likely also encounter conversations with campus partners. And so in that framing, you'll want to think about collaboration and the way in which this particular position or unit or division works with those campus partners. Again, thinking about those particular pillars. And then the last one is then my guess and hope is that there's also going to be time spent with your supervisor. And thinking about senior leadership, particularly if you may be in mid-level or even director level positions, the folks you're going to encounter with on a daily basis, they're actually going to judge your performance. You'll want to make sure that you're talking about relationship dynamics. What does the supervisor and supervisee role look like? What does accountability look like? I referenced this idea of success and how you'll be measured. Those would be appropriate questions at that time to pose to supervisors and think about that structure. In a on-campus interview environment, you would have that opportunity probably for a tour to think about the way the campus is laid out. And so in our virtual world, it's unlikely that you'll have that. And so you'll want to maybe also think about questions and ways in which you can ask them to provide you a virtual experience, and whether that's something that they already will craft and create and have on their website, by way of a virtual map or tour of their campus facilities. Perhaps that could be a question that you do as a follow-up to them, or the ways that they can provide you with the different materials, additional materials to consider as you really think about your sense of place and connection to a campus that you may not necessarily have the opportunity to walk around or engage very differently in the era of which we're in. And here's where I'll pause, and if there are questions, to post them in the chat. Otherwise, I can continue to talk and provide examples.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I think so far this has been a great presentation, and we actually have a few questions that were sent to us privately. Okay. So one of the questions that we received was, and I feel like many of us have experienced this before in the past, especially as graduate students or new professionals. I need experience to get a job, but I need a job to get experience. What can I do?
Yes. So, yes. So ideally, they're going to say, well, you're going to supervise, but you have no supervisory experience. And so what I think is beneficial there, if I'm understanding that's the question that was raised, is to think about what you tell your student leaders and the way in which that the job that they're doing may not necessarily align with what they ultimately want to do. Where are those transferable skills? Where are those opportunities for you to showcase and shine and maybe show that you actually do have this? It just isn't framed in the way that it's written in their job description. And so when they talk about supervision and levels of experience that you may not have, if it's not direct to the work you do, think about all of the collaborative opportunities, the project-based and committee work that you've done, and maybe showcase the ways in which you've been able to pull a team together that expresses and gets to that without saying that you've had that direct type of experience. Usually, again, that shows up by way of supervision and or leading a team. While being a part of a committee wasn't your team, it can actually maybe move you to a place where you can say, in my role on this particular committee or strategic initiative, I was able to do the following, which I would then use in this position to be an effective leader or an effective supervisor or fill in the blank of a particular project or initiative. I hope I heard that question correctly and answered it appropriately for those that asked.
I think so. Thank you so much. So another related question, is it okay for me to ask about growth opportunities in the position? Do they see the position being promoted and growing within the organization? How do you ask those types of questions?
Yes. So earlier on, I talked about this idea of how will this contribute to my growth. I think what is important is certainly you want to think about the expansion of the position, but you don't want to lead in with that as if you're already thinking about doing other things beside the task being asked of you. And so what you may want to do is figure out how to frame questions in particularly looking through the job description and maybe highlighting a particular section. So let's say that the job description requires you to work with a group of students and maybe serve as their advisor. And so what you may want to consider is how will advising students help you in your overall growth? That may in your head mean, will that mean I have conference attendance? Will I have an opportunity to expand? Will I be able to use my passion area, which has nothing to do with this particular focus, to actually get me to that? I think what you want to be conscious of is to not think about the job you want and focus on the job that's being offered to you, and then figure out how you can weave that in. So the example I gave of the advising piece, let's say it's advising is in your job description, but you really have a passion to advise a different type of group. Where I think you could artfully blend the two is to think about the role that you have in this particular position advising, say, RHA. The question could be posed is there opportunity to collaborate or expand such that these groups work differently with other groups that maybe you do have an affinity towards or passion level of support, that now you can marry those two opportunities. I think it is very important, particularly as new professionals coming in, is that you are conscious that you are going to be offered and work in an environment. They want you to be solid in the job you are being offered and have, and then proving that you have that capacity to do that work solidly makes a greater avenue for you to then move into those growth opportunities and expand your portfolio.
Thanks, Brenda. I think that was very helpful for a lot of our new professionals that are on the call. Another question that we have that I think is very timely for a lot of folks right now is around timeline and asking about timeline. So the question is how to approach asking for timeline after the on-campus interview in the midst of hiring uncertainty. How do you ask questions about about timeline and what the timeline would be like moving forward?
Okay. So I have two philosophies on that, and I'm glad that you framed it after the kind of on-campus experience. The first is to avoid asking the question of next steps as part of your question and answer period. So when you are given the end of your particular interview and they say, do you have any questions for us? I really try to tell folks to hold off on asking the next steps question because it eats up time for a very pivotal question that you could ask that may help you frame whether or not this is even an institution or position that you want to be a part of. Most employers are going to find an opportunity to insert that at the end of their interview process with you. So avoid asking that particular question if you can. I think what would be helpful then is if in not asking it, and particularly if then the employer doesn't mention it, then in the follow-up email that you would send to them, thanking them for their time and consideration for the position is where you can ask the next steps question. And that's where you could probably be a little bit more detailed in that follow-up, particularly if you move from first round to the on-campus or virtual experience. Then I think the next steps can look very differently, particularly in the wake of COVID. And maybe that's simply how you frame it, is start by saying, recognizing and understanding that this may result in more time that you need. Could you provide a realistic time frame for me to consider this position while also contemplating other positions in that? I think it's appropriate to indicate that you're in multiple searches. I don't think it's appropriate for you to tell them where. And that's one of those things you kind of you hold some information close to the vest, but we also want, I think it's important for you to be transparent in saying that, you know, you're looking in other places. And I would actually even say sometimes to say that even if you haven't actually gotten full leads. Sometimes that's a push employers need to know that this isn't the only job that you're looking for and moves them to think differently. I would also just simply say from an employer standpoint is that most times after we've gotten to the place of the on-campus process is that it moves out of our direct control into the control of other entities and campus partners, more specifically our HR department. And so sometimes the delay in getting back to you around communication is not necessarily that folks are sitting idly. It may be that they're simply waiting for HR to move in any particular direction, either within a system that they're working in, or to give you the go-ahead to move forward with offer, background checks, things of that nature. So I hope that's helpful in thinking about how you frame and ask those next steps questions.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. One that we have here is, how soon is too soon to leave a temporary position? Will leaving early appear in a negative way on an application or reflect negatively on an application?
Could you repeat that again for me, Colleen?
Sorry about that. So the question is, how soon is too soon to leave a temporary position? Would leaving early appear negatively on an application?
Okay. So early is relative. In an age where student affairs is in a position where we do a lot of communication and talk about self-care and knowing myself and finding the right place that works for you, I don't know that we need to be in a place where we talk about the appropriate time you spend at a particular institution. For many folks, that they may feel like that was the right time to make a decision that had nothing to do with the campus or that role, that there were life events that took place. And I think all you need to be able to do is to honestly speak and reflect about why you left a position. I will speak very personally and candidly that if you were to look at my resume, there was a period early on in my career where I did 2-year stays at a particular institution, and that happened at least 3 times consecutively. And so if we were to think in a traditionalist model, folks would go, wow, you weren't really spending a lot of time at that particular institution. Why? or may even dismiss me in a search process because they didn't see that I had longevity. And so what I was able to do was tackle that right in my cover letter so that they didn't have an opportunity to actively and openly dismiss me. And I talked about the way in which I non-traditionally entered the world of student affairs. And for that reason, I had to be intentional and strategic with where I took positions and how long I stayed at those positions if I wanted to move in a direction where I currently sit now as an assistant dean, ultimately wanting to get to a dean level position. And so I think one of the things that you just have to be able to do is just speak truthfully. If you know in your core that this isn't the right place for you, then it's appropriate for you to leave. And I just think you need to find a way to artfully talk about that departure, that one isn't a throwing under the bus of the institution, and you frame it more from an I statement. I felt I needed this in my life, or other circumstances required that I leave this position and think about other opportunities. Speaking honestly and intentionally, and maybe even getting in front of it, may minimize that opportunity for folks to keep bringing it up in an interview process.
Thank you so much, Brenda. So I think we have one more question left, or time for one more question left. So the question is, how do you ask questions about inclusion when you see there's a need that has not been addressed on campus, such as a lack of support for a group of students, or a need of support for maybe professionals on campus?
Sure. I think what you can certainly do is frame questions. I guess one of the things is that if you are trying to avoid being direct and saying, levels of inclusion, or finding ways to frame that, is to maybe speak about how does the campus define community? How do students find ways to build community in ways that represent who they are, but more importantly, those that don't necessarily represent or reflect their own identities? How does the campus then contribute to supporting that? And then if you can get that in a student perspective, if that's your role in supporting students, then you can layer that and say, and as a follow-up, then what is that level of support and community? How is the community defined for the professional staff? How have others sought out ways of connection that isn't always tied to the work we do? And that, in hearing how people respond to that, may help you better understand the campus climate as it relates to diversity and inclusion, and the way in which you may either be represented or not represented on that campus.
Thank you so much for coming in today, Brenda, and presenting to us on this wonderful topic. I know that it's very timely right now for a lot of our professionals. We really appreciate you joining us. If folks have other additional questions that they weren't able to ask today, is there a way that they can get in touch with you?
Absolutely. One of the things that I have done and continue to do in my role in student affairs is to pay it forward. And so I will always be available to anyone interested in mentorship, or just particularly in this one, just looking for insight in the interview process or anything related to student affairs. You can reach me at BICE, that's BICE, at scrippscollege.edu. And hopefully they can include that in the chat window for you to reach out to me. As I said, I also serve as the chair-elect and soon-to-be chair of the TPE Planning Committee. And so you can also reach me there at info@theplacementexchange.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much once again. So I hope you all join me in thanking Brenda for her wonderful presentation and for answering your questions. We'll have her contact information in the chat shortly. Our next presenter is not on the call just yet, so we will all sit tight until they're able to join us, and we'll get started at 3 o'clock.
Thank you.